If you've never tuned in before, we are on a mission of the possibility of making a difference to global warming. My name is Gary Kasulu. Charles, do you want to introduce yourself, sir?
Welcome everybody, really pleased that you can join us. This is the webinar Climate and Humanity 2030, What's Possible? And I'm really pleased today to be joined by Annie, who's going to help me talk about global warming and what makes a difference. But this is the first session of the whole webinar, so let's just give a little bit of an introduction to the whole thing. So the way I see it, 2021 is absolutely such a critical year. It's almost certainly the last year that we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And yet today, we're actually on track for 3 degrees. So this webinar is really all about helping people. It's about helping people with what's happening with global warming, what we can do about it, to move people from talking about it to taking action. So success for today is not about people saying, oh, well, that was interesting, right? It's about people actually choosing to take action. So I'm really, really pleased to be here with Annie. So let's introduce Annie. So I met Gary and I together, we met Annie just 2 weeks ago on Clubhouse. So the power of Clubhouse. And so we did a webinar, we did a room together with Annie. And so here's Annie on the webinar as an expert speaker on communication. So Annie, do please introduce yourself.
That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here. As you can tell, I am not from the UK, thanks to my Canadian accent. But yeah, so Annie Constantinescu, in case you're wondering how to say that last name. So I've been working in the advertising communications field for about 8-9 years right now. But about 3 years ago, I actually switched and started becoming very focused on how do we give the planet a voice since it doesn't actually have one for itself. And that kind of opened this entire world of taking this huge concept that we know as global warming, as sustainability, and breaking it down into bite-sized, digestible pieces so that people can hopefully understand it a little bit better and be able to have conversations on their own. So that was what sparked this Climate Change Sunday School, which is essentially a weekly educational series where
I love that.
I'm excited.
Is that your idea?
Thank you.
I love it.
We have fun. That's what we try to do all the time.
Could we say a link to that Facebook group, because I think it's genius.
It's primarily done through Instagram because the Instagram stories feature helps with the visual components. I did a master's and my thesis was focused on how do we talk about climate change and what do we need to incorporate to best enact that individual change. And the visual component has been helped. No offense to Facebook, but Instagram has kind of helped a little bit more in that area.
So if you've just tuned in, we really want the world of possibilities to speak to some amazing speakers today, and they're all experts in their field. And we've got Annie, who is a communication expert. Charles, where do you want this to go? What things are we going to talk about today?
Well, the thing is, Gary and Annie, this whole webinar is about communication. It's about communicating to people the problem of global warming, the fact we can do something about it, and what to do about it. So people don't need to be helpless. They don't need to feel, oh my goodness, what do I do now? You know, it might be all right. Well, the fact is, it won't be all right unless we actually do something about it. So the whole webinar is about communication. So I'm really, really pleased to have communications specialist expert with us to kick off the webinar. So tell us a bit about this history of what's going on with climate communications, Annie, because it's overall it's not been very successful so far. So talk to us about this.
Yeah, of course. That's my bread and butter, Charles, so thank you. So the history of climate communications, if you can believe it, dates back to the late 1800s when the first scientific report related to carbon in our atmosphere was introduced. It was by a gentleman named John Tyndall, and as you can guess, he was a scientist. That's important because for probably the first 70, 80 years of this climate narrative, it was predominantly focused on scientists telling that story and being the narrative holder of what's happening to our planet. But as you can imagine, if you try to take a time machine approach and bring yourself back to that age, not everyone was fairly academic and could understand what scientists were saying. So it caused this huge barrier. So that's kind of problem number one with climate communications, is that a lot of the times we're hearing very academic talk about what's happening. That causes a disconnect between what we understand and what is actually happening. So it makes us kind of turn away. Point number two is that once the media, so in the 50s, 60s, once the media started understanding that, oh, this is important, we should talk about it, they started becoming the narrative storytellers for the climate. But unfortunately, as you can kind of know with the media, especially newspapers at that time and radio shows, is that they really wanted to sensationalize the information to make it interesting. No one's gonna pay attention if they say, well, in 200 years, maybe if the carbon is a little bit more than it is now, we're going to have some problems. No, they took the extreme cases and scenarios that the academic papers were reporting on, and it was essentially the ice caps are melting, the polar bears all are going to die. So we had this big sense of fear-based narratives, which was point number two, is that when you start hearing these really scary things, you kind of ostrich a little bit and stick your head in the sand, because you're saying, that's too much for me. I'm not, that's a bit more than I can bite off. And what can I even do if it's something as big and global? So those 2 points kind of leads us to where we are now, where luckily there's a lot more story-based narratives. So it's people who are actually impacted by climate change or global warming, or people who are working in that space, and we're hearing their stories, which is really helped, especially since the beginning of the internet, helped make the communications a lot more accessible and friendly and not as intimidating as they have been for almost 160 years.
So Annie, let's talk then about this balance of fear and encouragement. I mean, just putting a photograph up about choosing a photo, which is Gary and his team, their expertise, just choosing a photo about global warming. So should we choose, it's tempting to choose a fear-based photo, photo of fires and this sort of thing. So should we choose a fear-based photo, or should we choose a positive photo of people planting trees or turning down their central heating or something like that? How do we balance this, Annie?
That's a great question, and there's a lot of very brilliant people who are still working on finding that balance. Unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet answer, because everyone is different and responds to different things. However, what there has been a notice of is that people need that hope. They need that ability to say, I see my role in it, I see my part in it, and I think if I can do this, that we can get to this goal. The problem with fear-based narratives is that it doesn't allow for that your values to shift towards something you want. It's essentially you trying to run away from something you don't want. And when it's effective, don't get me wrong, in certain scenarios, especially even if you think of how we've evolved as a human species, like the fear is what keeps us alive. But we're in this not for the short sprint, we're in it for the long haul, and we really need to be mindful that we can't just do something that elicit these very knee-jerk reactions. We want people to understand, and that's where the positive imagery, the positive narratives of it's going to be hard, but this is why we're doing it, can help really build a strong base so people can build off of it. But that's a phenomenal question.
Great. So you've put hope on the table, Annie, right? That's really great. So in terms of hope, let's ask you in a minute to talk about Joe Biden as a symbol of hope. But first of all, let's just set the scene with people maybe just joining us to say that, look, this whole webinar is not about fear-based, it's not negative about climate change. All the speakers we've got, everyone's talking about positive messages about what can be done, how we can help, how people can join in, and how we can protect the planet and have a world which is the 1.5 world, which we're flagging here, the 1.5 world, which is the world 1.5 degree max world, which is similar to the world we have now. So Annie, give us your take on, you're not from the US, but you're near to the US, you're in Toronto. Give us your take on Joe Biden and some hope.
Yeah, it's so most Canadians have been closely following US politics more than they usually would over the last 4 years. And I think the difference that we're seeing over the last few months since Joe Biden was elected, specifically within the global warming community, is that there is finally someone who will be at the top of the command chain, who understands and will actually give a space for scientists. It's not so much that there's a difference. I mean, any politician who comes in will say that these are the things they believe in, these are the things they want to achieve. But the biggest difference with Joe Biden coming to the stage is that it's just such a stark comparison, because his predecessor wasn't even giving the time of day to scientists who were trying to say, we're running out of time. And it was such a unfortunate time that he was in office, Trump was in office, was because it was during this very crucial, we need to change things now. So Americans over the last 4 years have seen institutions and organizations who were founded to help the planet, to help ecosystems, essentially be dismantled. And science was essentially thrown out the window for ulterior agendas, whereas now people start having hope, because Joe Biden, one of the first few things he did when he came into office was reestablish those organizations that are there to protect the planet. And of course, he did the very triumphant action of rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. So just those actions alone is giving people hope, because that, yes, we're back on track. And there's a lot of Americans. There's actually a study that came out of Yale University, which is a fairly prominent university within the States, saying that right now 70% of Americans believe in climate change. So that's a huge number compared to what it would have been a decade ago. So now that more people believe in it and more people are understanding the importance, they're very happy to have a leader who
now,
is
Annie,
aligned with that.
I love communicating. I love communicating to all different types of people. So when we look at splitting the difference between speaking to a child, speaking to a teenager, speaking to an adult of a certain education, maybe university degree, that level, and maybe left school. They need, there's many different papers in this country, and the most popular one is the most basic. and I don't think people, it's a fact that the more broadsheets are less read. So how do we've just spoken on a big picture, academic, and I speak to lots of people that say that they find it quite overwhelming. How do we not, without dumbing down the message, just simplify it? Just like you do at that Sunday school.
Yeah, they're great. That's essentially my work, and that is what I strive every single time I hear about something, is how do we take what's important and share it. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the trends that I've at least noticed is that there's so many mediums that are talking about it, and there's resources that we can now leverage to share versus us having to be essentially the sole communicator. While I am very reliant on high visuals, on showing examples of things actually happening in the planet, so really creating that visual connection, I honestly think one of the best platforms for educating is TikTok right now, essentially because of the very short format of this is somebody speaking within 60 seconds and sharing very high level information that's easy to be digested. So you're completely right that the more broken down and accessible and exciting information is, the easier it will be to be understood. And on top of that, it's not overwhelming with too much information. I think that's another things that we as communicators might find ourselves guilty of, especially when we're so passionate. You want to share everything, when in reality people need a digestion period to really understand. So that's what, even with the weekly series, is that you want people to be coming back, to be engaging further, to be building off of the knowledge they built off last week. So again, you can get them to grow their roots into the ground, and you're nurturing them weekly with more information, but not all at once, because then you're going to suffocate them like you would a plant, and that's not good.
So Gary, there's another area of Biden and hope that I want to talk about, which is completely different. So my friend Colin, whenever I talk to him about global warming, which is often, he normally says, well, what about India? What about China? Because they're much bigger countries than we are in the UK. I mean, Canada's by areas a massively much bigger country than we are, but but we're small players compared to India and China. So what I think is really, really important about Biden is that the international stage did get neglected over the last 4 or 5 years, and Biden's put in place John Kerry, who's top diplomat, and I think there's really the opportunity, as happened before the 2015 Paris Agreement. So what happened before then is that there was a behind the scenes deal done between China and the US to move global warming forward with the Paris Agreement. So that's all been more difficult because of what happened over the last 4 years with the politics, the international relations, the attempts at doing things with trade. That's all caused a lot of problems. So I'm really hoping that Biden and his team can smooth a lot of that over and get things moving, so that not necessarily acceding to a lot of the things that China or the US want internationally, but at least try and attempt to ring fence global warming, climate change as an area where this is a world problem that the world needs to solve. We've got some time before the big meeting. So the big meeting is COP26 in November 2021, which is in Glasgow. So there's still 9 months or so before that meeting for the everyone that's important to get together, have a chat, and look to bring in China and India and of course the US all together in what's happening. So if the biggest economies of the world are all agreeing on what needs to be done, then as I see it, there's some hope in pulling forward some of the world's economies who are less inclined to do this. So what do you think, Annie?
Oh, it's such an interesting time in history right now, especially with the timeline that you previously established for the climate and just the political landscape is constantly moving. It's so exciting. I think there's so much opportunity right now, and I hope that with the introduction of Joe Biden, other world leaders are recognizing that the U.S. is willing to step back up to the plate and take on their role again, as they have traditionally, as being leaders within any sort of global movement. It's something that I'm really excited to see how COP26 plays out. Obviously, with the Trump administration, political ties globally and their international policies were extremely impacted. Some can argue for the better, some can argue for the worse, but specifically for the planet, there has been an impediment of moving forward. So I'm really hoping that China, India, other major global leaders will understand that this is the moment that the US is starting to come together, and then hopefully globally we can come together.
Super. Well, I've got another question for you coming up, as you can imagine, Annie. But so let's get straight into that question then. So I'm really keen on 1.5. It's so important. Yeah, and my other point is that we've actually got 9 months before we get to the Glasgow meeting. So I want us the world to use those 9 months really productively in moving forward this whole dialogue. But so I'm really keen on 1.5 now, but just for people who maybe don't know the history of this so well, this was in the Paris Agreement as an idea, an aspiration. A report was released in 2018 by the IPCC, which is one of the technical groups. So in October 2018, they said, look, 1.5 degrees maximum is a much better idea than 2 degrees, which was in the Paris Agreement. And the reason is because it protects so much more the wildlife. The world is so much closer to how it is now. There's less risk of trigger points, but also fundamentally it's less expensive. It's going to be much more expensive if things get bad at 2 degrees or more. So since then there's been a lot of talk about it, Annie. Just wondering really over the next 9 months, what possibility is it, you think, of creating a real snowball effect so that everyone says, well, 1.5, well, surely we're going for 1.5. How on earth can we be going for 2 degrees or some compromise number when 1.5 is such an obvious number? So can we get the whole world to be part of this 1.5 snowball? What do you think?
Oh, I hope so. I think it starts with conversations like this ultimately. Like you're talking about a snowball effect. The way that any sort of global movement has traditionally come about is by people talking about it. It's by people being invested and sharing. We have the youth for maybe not the first time. There's obviously other parts where youth have been more engaged than older generations, but Greta Thunberg is really leading a charge on engaging this whole part of the population and getting them to be a part of the conversation, which is immaculate. And that started a snowball. We saw marches happening all across the world that was essentially started by a girl who said, I'm not going to school on Fridays because I want our planet to be protected and taken seriously when we're talking about what's happening in the future. 1.5 is, again, like that is a number we are right now. That is our best case scenario. And I think that the best way to even get people to understand is to almost paint that picture of this is, maybe, let me rephrase, because I had like 40 thoughts just pop into my head all at once. But the one of the interesting parts of the global warming scene is that there is still somehow a disconnect between what's happening in our weather systems, what's happening more on a day-to-day basis, and people actually tying it to this changing planet. Obviously, I think people are more welcoming of the idea of what it is, but I think that conversation needs to help solidify. I'm seeing more an increase in hurricanes during hurricane season. That is a direct tie to more carbon in the atmosphere. Whereas I think even political powers such as Trump really did a good job at spreading misinformation as to why that was even happening. So if we want people to understand a scientific term like 1.5 degrees, I think that there needs to be more of a conversation or more conversations happening about this is the reality we live in and the things we see around us. We can pretend they're normal, but they're not. And then hopefully that will help, again, really create that like solid snowball versus a one that's maybe just...
Now, Charles, Charles, we've only got a few minutes left with that.
I know, Gary, I'm blaming you. This is your fault. So look, Gary, we can't leave this conversation without talking about
I just got this burning question that I want to ask Annie before she goes.
You two are too much.
Gary, come on, we've got to talk about Clubhouse, but ask your question quick.
Right, I'm a quick one. You're a communications expert. How do we communicate really simply to the global warming deniers, the guys that know very little about global warming, the guys that feel overwhelmed with it? So the different categories need different tactics and strategies. So what do we say to global deniers that say, it's all nonsense? So what do we say to them?
Honestly, from my experience, the science doesn't work. It's one of those things that makes them ostrich. The fear-based narratives, almost the rational parts of it have to be put on hold for a while, because what you need to do with these individuals is to talk to them and relate to them on some sort of level like they're human beings. There's so much empathy that is required for any kind of global issue conversation. So my biggest recommendation is to find that common ground. Always approach conversations with respect, and it might not even be about the climate at the beginning, but it's getting people to understand that you are also a person. You just want to have an open conversation about what's happening, and then slowly start to bring that in.
I love that.
Hard work.
I could talk with you all day. If people want to reach out to you and communicate with you, how do they do that?
Great question. So the easiest format would be to go to my website, which is www.narrativeofclimatechange.com. I can share it in the chat after I'm done speaking. And then from there, you can find my Instagram handle, which is constantly_Annie. It's because it's Annie Constantinescu, but I've switched it around a little bit. But if you send me a message, either you can message me through the website or through Instagram, and I would be more than happy to continue.
Well, I'm going to hand back over to Charles, but what's remarkable, Charles, is for every one Canadian, there's like 2,500 trees. Now, guess where I learned that?
That's great. We need 2,500 more, Gary. So look, Gary, we've got to talk about Clubhouse before we go. So look, you're the expert. The three of us all met on Clubhouse. So Gary, give us your perspective first, and then over.
Well, the fun thing is nobody's an expert there because it's only been around since September. You can go and innovate in there. It's amazing. Charles is often in there. He told me off on Sunday for being on there for too often. It's quite addictive. You get an energy about somebody's voice that is just authentic. As soon as Annie spoke, I just connected with her and I thought, wow, this is an amazing human being. And this is something you can't fake. So it's just sound, and we're going to have an after webinar coffee or a drink or a cocktail, whatever you like, back at Clubhouse. We're going to be on there. What time, Charles? 9 o'clock.
9:45.
9:45.
Okay.
Wow.
Just before we come to the end, Gary,
UK
I think
time.
for me, the very, very interesting question with Clubhouse is that the standard of discussion and dialogue on there is just amazing. And I really wonder if there's a possibility, this is a question for Annie, of course, I wonder if there's a possibility that the world can move forward the dialogue, not just in climate, but on a whole range of topics, because people from across the world, experts, specialists, people interested, are talking about it. What do you think, Annie, just before we have to close?
Really quickly, I think that's one of the benefits and beautiful, magical parts of Clubhouse is that it allows you to understand different parts of the world. And if you remember earlier, I was talking about the impact and power of story-based narratives. So that's hearing people who are experiencing something different than you, and that's what's actually helping move this conversation along. I think Clubhouse, I mean, for me personally, I think of it like unfiltered live podcasts 24/7, all days of the year, because you get exposed to such amazing people like Gary, like yourself, Charles. It is just, we were talking about how to talk to people. This is a place where you can learn, equip yourself with tools to then hopefully engage more people, either bringing them on the platform or doing it outside, but really just like, it's a conversation starter, and like, what an impactful tool for that. I highly recommend it.
Annie, I tell you what, get comfortable, get your popcorn out, because the next speaker is mind-blowingly good.